Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear students, sorry for the delay, we apologize. And I have the pleasure this evening to open with you the series of conferences, Thought, Rationalities, Touches, and Societies of Islam. Yesterday, today, tomorrow. In my quality of spokesman of a project that has been set up at the level and is supported by one of the three sectors of the Catholic University of Louvain, the sector of humanities and social sciences. Embedded in the strategic framework of the university called Horizon 2020, it gathers academics and researchers from 3 faculties, 5 research institutes, and 6 groups, group and research centers. I hope I haven't covered anybody, any research or teaching body. The conference of today also benefits from the support of the Valle Latour Fund, and last but not least from the cooperation with the Louvain School of Translation and Interpreting in the framework of its traineeship program. Let us encourage our 2 UCL fellow students in interpretation, Edouard Bertrand-Beignet and Robin Roy. And we thank them a lot in advance for their contribution. And indeed, the idea that we had in mind when we set up the project was to build a series of conferences that would, of course, be accessible to the university community of students, researchers, academics, and other colleagues, but also to a wider audience. The challenge is indeed to make a contribution to research, teaching, and service to society around Islam, in sharing with international experts, and thanks to them and our encounter with them to build an understanding about the phenomenon of Islam as faith, culture, and society that goes beyond simplistic assessments and truly grasps Islam in all its diversity and complexity. This is a good start today with a conference by Professor Carool Kersten on Islam in Indonesia. To my students who follow my introductory course on the Arab world at the university, I used to start with the terms Arab Muslim world, to tell them very rapidly that if indeed Islam was born in the Arab world, Arabs as Muslims are a minority in the Muslim world. And in the same line today, our first conference is about Indonesia, the largest country in the world with a majority Muslim population. Enough talking, I give the floor to my colleague Professor Abdessamad Belhaj, who will introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Carool Kersten, to you.
Professor Carool Kersten, who is a leading authority and scholar on Indonesia, as well on contemporary Islamic thought. I will say a few words about his career, his academic career, and I will introduce the major books he authored about Indonesia. Professor Kersten is a senior lecturer at the King's College London on Islam and the study of contemporary Muslim societies. He is also a research associate at the SOAS University in London. He was a researcher in Southeast Asia and also in the Middle East. He conducted research in different contexts of the Muslim society. So he gained insight into how these societies work, but he also worked on different Muslim authors, critical Muslim authors, and we had the chance to discover some of these authors this afternoon with a seminary we had with him. Professor Kersten authored 9 books, among which we should mention his major book on Indonesia, which is Islam in Indonesia, a contest of the contest for society, ideas and values. This is a book that became very important in terms of the field of Indonesian studies. But he told us today that last week a second book he published on Indonesia was published already. So I think we are very lucky to have an expert in Indonesia to introduce us to that fascinating world which is Southeast Asia. Thank you very much for being here. Without further ado, I welcome Professor Kersten.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Now I have to live up to all the expectations that have been raised by my colleagues. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank UCL for taking this initiative and giving me an opportunity to present a few of my thoughts here on today's topic. Am I audible like this? Yeah. Islam in Indonesia, and I was advised to use the title Religion and Public Life in what I never tire of to emphasize, the world's largest Muslim nation state. 1 in 5 Muslims on the planet lives in Indonesia, a fact that is often forgotten. Now to start my talk, I want to refer to an event that took place in Jakarta in May last year, when the leader of the largest traditionalist Muslim mass organization in Indonesia and in the world, the Nahdlatul Ulama, the nations of the scholars, but abbreviated often in Indonesian into NU, presented the so-called Jakarta Declaration, in which they make a case that there is something very instructive for the rest of the Muslim world in what they call Islam Nusantara, the Islam of Southeast Asia. So they look actually beyond their own country, even. Not suggesting that it is a sort of an export product which must be adopted elsewhere in the Muslim world. The message is actually to present Islam Nusantara as a source of inspiration for Muslims elsewhere, also to be sensitive to their own cultural distinctiveness, which brings a sort of the general tenets of the Muslim world together, but also make it distinct in different geographical areas. So in order for us to start making sense of what then this Indonesian Islam is, and indeed, is there such a thing as an Indonesian Islam? Well, I think I have to talk to you first a little bit about key historical features before launching into the real talk on Islam in contemporary Indonesia, which is much closer to the general activities of SISMO, which is sort of the driving force behind today's meeting. I've done that. I'm shameless in promoting my own books. I've done that in 2 books. The historical part is covered indeed in A History of Islam in Indonesia, which, as Abasama just pointed out, has recently appeared. Islam in Indonesia has been around now for almost 1.5 to 2 years. Very pleased to know also now that it's going to be translated into Indonesian and hopefully will reach much wider audiences in Indonesia itself, and hopefully make Indonesian Muslims feel good about themselves. I think they have a lot to be proud of, and they have a lot to share. So if I talk about the history of Islam in Indonesia, I'll spend just a few minutes on that and go through it rather briskly, but feel free to raise questions or ask me to come back to certain points if you find them interesting when we're going to have questions and discussions, because we're going to have questions and discussion as well, right? So, if I talk about history of Islam in Indonesia, a few key points. One thing you have to notice is that the arrival was relatively late. We're talking 13th, 14th century that we have the first tangible evidence that the indigenous population of Indonesia is starting, or what is now Indonesia, let's be careful here, starts to adopt Islam as a religion. Another distinguishing feature is that the introduction was initially peaceful. It was not part of the Arab conquests of the 7th, 6th and 8th centuries. It came much later, and it was not part of that sort of military expansion early on. It gave rise to a Malay Muslim culture, which is sort of, you know, is then a new phenomenon, alongside the Arabic, Persianate, Turkic, Swahili and Hausa Muslim cultures we can distinguish elsewhere. The technical word they use in Indonesia and also in Arabic for Southeast Asian Islam is Jawi. I'll say a few more things about that in a minute. And finally, the further development historically of Indonesian Islam I have qualified as network Islam. Another point I will briefly come back to as I progress. First we have to look at the introduction of Islam. As I said, it was late. We have established that. So, in regards to the question of chronology, the when, we can establish, okay, it is late, but why then? So I'll move into that later on. Closely connected with that is provenance. Where did Islam come from? From where was it introduced? And then very important, the question of agency. Who brought it? And maybe there we get also a few inklings as to the why question. Why did Muslims, or why did Indonesians at a certain point embrace Islam and decide to become Muslims? The evidence we have for the when question is, well, partly external. There is a mention in the travels of Marco Polo, who visited northern Sumatra in the late 13th century, where he said, guess what, there's a Muslim sultan here in northern Sumatra, and the people are embracing Islam. And on the ground we have some evidence as well. They have discovered tombstones in northern Sumatra and in the Gresik area, in eastern Java as well, which gives an indication that something is happening. This is a tombstone of a local Muslim ruler with an Arabic name, and no longer referred to as a Raja, but as a Sultan, which is an Arabic word for a ruler. So we have a sort of material evidence and circumstantial evidence from external written sources that at this point in time we can have a degree of certainty to the fact that people we now call Indonesians are starting to become Muslims. Next, where does that come from? Because as you can see, Indonesia is located on the eastern periphery of the Indian Ocean, far removed from the historical heartlands of the Muslim world. So, who brought Islam there? We have the first evidence of these tombstones in Aceh, which is sort of logical. It's in the tip of Sumatra, the big, most western island of the Indonesian archipelago, and as you can see, it's really protruding into the Indian Ocean. So it's very tempting to say, well, who are the closest Muslims? Well, you find them in the Coromandel coast of Southeast India, Madras area. There is something to be said for that kind of a connection. Bengal, also located in the geographical proximity of the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra, so that's a good candidate as well. The Malabar coast, just around the corner, so to speak, from the Coromandel. And as I said earlier, these tombstones, the tombstones we found from the late 13th century, both in terms of the material used and the style of the stones, have a connection with the province of Gujarat. So either the stuff came from there, or was maybe even fabricated there and brought eventually to Southeast Asia and have names engraved in it, or at least raw materials have been coming from that area, but then still the artisans were apparently familiar with the Gujarati style. So South Asia, for a variety of reasons, is a prime candidate. We can also not discount the importance of southern Arabia, in particular the Hadramaut area in the interior of what is now South Yemen. There are large Hadrami communities around the Indian Ocean, and you also find them in large numbers in Southeast Asia, including Indonesia. There are very important Muslim families who still bear the names of Hadrami clans and tribes. And also we have found recently tantalizing mentions of Muslims from Southeast Asia in Yemeni manuscripts going back to the 14th, 15th century. Colleagues of mine have discovered a text where they refer to a person called Masoud al-Jawi, which, you know, turns actually the timetables very much topsy-turvy in terms of when scholars from Southeast Asia started to frequent the Middle East. Other parts, the seafarers of the Persian Gulf, they have been trading with Indonesia anyway, well, long before they themselves became Muslims. Connections between Persia, Arabia, and what is now Indonesia even took place before Islam existed in the first place. Suggestions have been made that Egypt might be part of the story, and that's mainly because of the presence of the Shafi'i school. Not that convinced about it because the coastal areas of India are Shafi'i too. So that would be a sufficient explanation. Maybe less likely, but a persuasive case can be made, is the involvement of China. But that would be in a sort of step-by-step process. China was converted relatively, or no, not converted. Islam was introduced to China relatively early. There's even hadiths of uncles of the Prophet being involved in that. But at some point, the Muslims were also kicked out of China, and there is tantalizing evidence that this may have something to do with, in particular, the conversion of the northern coast of Java, a region known as the Pasisir. Why? Because there is a connection with where these Chinese Muslims went when they were evicted from the Chinese Empire. They went to a place called Champa, which was the empire of the Chang people, located in what's now South Vietnam. Their civilization has since collapsed, but there's still Chang people found in South Vietnam, in Cambodia, and also in Thailand. These people speak Austronesian languages, not Sino-Tibetan languages like Thai, Vietnamese, and other ones. Linguistically, the Cham language has a connection to Java. There is also mythology and legends of Javanese princesses marrying princes from Champa and the other way around. So something has been going on further east as well, where Islam traveled from China to Champa and then to Java. Yeah, so we have multiple places from where Islam originated and from where it was introduced to what we now call Indonesia. That poses the other question. Why would? Well, it has been said, traders, of course. You know, you said it was peaceful. What kind of people travel? Traders. Well, traders do business. They are not in it to convert people. But what can be said is that probably professional propagators, da'is, dua, people who do dawah, the propagation of Islam, and Sufi sheikhs may have used these trade routes to reach these places as well. You just have to be very careful that you not simply say it's the merchants who did it. There was probably sort of professional religious scholars traveling along the same routes. Why? Why then? Why überhaupt would Indonesians at a certain point adopt new religions? We have evidence of earlier religious deposits, Hinduism, Buddhism, lots of indigenous religious practices. Why give that all up and become a Muslim? Well, some say it was commercial, but I'm not certain about that. It may have been a contributing factor to tap into wider trade networks, but if that's the case, And why did Chinese religions never catch on in Southeast Asia except among the Chinese expatriate communities? The Chinese have even traded longer than probably Persians and Arabs and Indians with what is now Indonesia. Some people have said European colonization. Well, if you have paid attention to the timeline, that doesn't make sense. 13th, 14th century predates the arrival of Alfonso Albuquerque, who conquered Malacca only in 1511. And Vasco da Gama didn't even make landfall in India before 1498. So there was no Europeans in the Indian Ocean basin before the 16th century. So that's not a convincing explanation either. I think there is indigenous political motivations that are more convincing. And what I'm talking about here is that the rulers of maritime Southeast Asia, that big island world that now encompasses Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, southern provinces of the Philippines and Thailand and Brunei. Don't forget Brunei, makes the Brunei people very angry. They were looking for new political allies. Why? What's the story? It's this. Southeast Asia is a forested island world. This is what mainland Southeast Asia looks like. Fertile, large river plains in Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, which give the economic surplus to build empires. The Hindu-Buddhist empires of Padang, the Khmer at Angkor, Ayutthaya and Sukhothai in Thailand, and the same story also applies to Vietnam, but they are not really part of this story. They have more connections with the Sinized world. The only place where you find a little bit of this, on a miniature scale, is on Java, but nowhere else in Southeast Asia, or maritime Southeast Asia, that's the case. Because Southeast Asia, you talk about the Malay-Indonesian archipelago, looks like this. It's jungle with trading outposts and the large river arteries that crisscross islands like Sumatra, Borneo, to some extent also Java. That it has no economic hinterland, there is no empires. So all these Malay petty chieftains were often reduced to vassal status of the empires of, in particular Ayutthaya, in the case of the Malay Peninsula and even the islands of Indonesia. They often had to pay tribute to these bigger empires. So these people wanted to be left alone, and they thought, what else can we do? Well, we have to find other political allies into which sphere of influence we can gain access. And then they look at the Indian Ocean zone, which has been described by two much more competent historians than myself. Oliver Walters calls it the neutral contact zone. What he means by that, the Indian Ocean is so vast, there's so many opportunities, and it's bordered by so many different states and empires that if you're persecuted in one place, there's always somewhere else to go. And later on, it also develops into an Islamic ecumene, as Michael Laffan calls it, because the coastal areas of India are Islamized. You have Arabia, Persia, east coast of Africa, and Indonesia actually, by adopting Islam, becomes a part of that network. And we should not forget the islands scattered across the Indian Ocean as well. The Seychelles, the Maldives, the Comoro Islands, all are sort of very small but Islamized countries. And they probably had very similar motivations as the people living in Indonesia and what is now Malaysia. We often have the wrong idea about the Indian Ocean because our maps always look like that. They are sort of drawn from the perspective of Vasco da Gama. There you come from Portugal, you round the Cape, and there is this massive ocean, and you have no clue where you're going. You don't know the constellations, you don't know anything about the currents and the winds. So somewhere around Madagascar probably, he had to hire a Persian pilot who helped him navigate to where now Goa is in India, and finally made landfall. But people living around the Indian Ocean have a different view. I always use this map and my students start laughing. Ha ha, slide is upside down. I did that for a purpose. Because if you take this view, the Indian Ocean looks like a Mediterranean. It's like an inner sea. And people navigate along the coasts. Yeah? It's less scary than when you come around the cave and you have a northern orientation and you don't know where the hell you are. Yeah? But people in India, Arabia, and East Africa, they can just stay within the side of land even and gradually navigate around. So we just have a wrong idea about the Indian Ocean. The local people have done this since times immemorial. Don't forget that the influences of the Austronesian people in prehistory stretch from Madagascar to Easter Island. Linguists have established that, and archaeologists based on utensils, musical instruments. There are huge similarities from Madagascar across the Indian Ocean into Indonesia itself and then all the way into the Pacific. These people were very competent seafarers. They just didn't leave any maps for us. The maps were here. Yeah? So, in conclusion, in regards to history, there is no single Big Bang theory, as Tony Jones called it. It's not an either or, it's an and story. Here are a few of his other statements. Each center has its own story to tell, and we have to accept that there is probably a variety of starting points and numerous modalities for this diffusion of Islam in an area that encompasses 13,000 islands and 300 ethnic groups or something close to that. There is a single explanatory story to tell. Yeah? So it's very complex, makes it exactly interesting, I think, for scholars like us. But it did trigger the development of a distinct Malay-Muslim culture, with Malay as the lingua franca for these people. The name they use for that culture is derived from Arabic, it's Jawi, but it does not just refer to the island of Java. Even in almost all these geography, there is mention of the Java people, and when you read it, it becomes clear from the jungle produce that is mentioned that it includes the whole of Indonesia and even parts of Cambodia, Thailand, and you name it. If you go to Saudi Arabia today, you go to the souks, they still sell oud Jawi, Javanese sandalwood. That does not only come from the island of Java, it's going to Sumatra. Yeah, so it is now a new culture that arises. Malay starts to be written in Arabic script. So Jawi is now used as the shorthand for the Malay language written by Southeast Asian Muslims using Arabic script. And the first texts we have are chronicles, like the stories of the Rajas of Pasai. Pasai was exactly that sultanate visited by Marco Polo already in the 13th century. There is the history of Melayu, the history of the Banten area in West Java, and there is even the chronicle of the island of Java. So there's a whole literature that starts emerging. Unfortunately, manuscripts are perishable, and the only safe indications we have don't predate the 16th, 17th century that we know manuscripts did exist of this Jawi culture. To show you this notion of network Islam, as I said, I use that term for the further expansion and gradual integration of Muslim Southeast Asia into the wider Muslim world. Aceh is an interesting example of that. As I said, it was already one of the places where it's likely Muslims first made landfall because of its geographical position. It's often referred to in Malay as Serambi Mecca, Mecca's veranda, exactly because it sort of protrudes into the Indian Ocean. But I think it's very important to understand that when Islam is introduced somewhere, that doesn't mean that the local people remain passive recipients. They become active agents in further Islamization of their region. I mentioned earlier that tantalizing evidence of the presence of a Southeast Asian Muslim in Yemen, probably in the 14th, 15th century already. They were good seafarers, I said that too. So the people from there also went to the centers of Islamic learning, of course in South Asia, but also in Yemen, the Haramain, Mecca and Medina, and in later centuries also to Cairo. Islamization is then a process that goes on for hundreds of years. It is not a thin veneer, as Clifford Geertz called it, because it's so far removed from Arabia and Persia that if you scratch an Indonesian underneath, he's actually a Buddhist or a Hindu. That's not the care. These people know Arabic very well. Scholars would spend often decades in Mecca and Medina ministering to the yearly visiting pilgrims from their homelands and becoming like, people who could advise them and educate them further in things Islamic. To illustrate briefly how sophisticated Southeast Asian Islam was, that in the 16th to 18th century, Aceh really became a center of Islamic learning. Malacca had been conquered by the Portuguese, so Aceh took over the mantle of Islamic learning. And there was in the early 17th century a lively debate at the Aceh court between proponents and opponents of a very sophisticated Sufi doctrine known as, you're very welcome to forget that eventually, Wahdatul Wujud, which is a notion of, that the transcendent is immanent in the world. It's very controversial. It was introduced by, in particular, a Sufi scholar, Ibn al-Arabi, but the people in Sumatra were familiar with that and debated it. And some people were in favor of it. They thought it fitted very well with how they experienced Islam. But other people were against it, and they sided with the ideas of an Indian reformist of the 16th and 17th century, Ahmad Sirhindi, who favored a much soberer interpretation of Sufism. Aceh was the scene of fierce debate, including book burnings and persecutions between opponents and proponents of the Wahdatul Wujud doctrine. You need to know your scripture and your Islam very well to be able to appreciate and take part in these debates. So that is a sort of an instance to demonstrate that it's not a thin veneer. We're talking about serious, committed, learned Muslims here. Java is always special, has its own story to tell. But again, a lot of the things I said earlier resonate also in Java. The stories of the introduction there of Islam are very much associated with the story of some of the young saints, or semi-historical, semi-legendary figures, who are credited with introducing Islam to various parts of the island of Java. All of these people in their biography have some connection with Arabia. Either they're born there or descendants of. So there is a great effort made also in Java to demonstrate direct connections with the Islamic heartlands. Yeah? It's not only some syncretic process where some elements of Islam are combined with Buddhism and Hinduism, which is very tempting on our island in Java in particular, because you trip everywhere over Hindu and Buddhist temples or the ruins of these temples. But at the same time, Merle Rickleff's the authority on the history of the Islamization of Java does talk about a mystic synthesis where indeed also writings start to occur about Islam in Javanese. Sacred language, a very important cultural language throughout Indonesia, but again in Arabic script. The tombs of the Wali Songo are still venerated throughout Java, and there is a whole commodification going on, and also the descendants of the Wali Songo or people with connections with the Hadrami diaspora, either of Sayyid descent or people who are known as Habibs, so the blessed ones, Sufi sheikhs, are still very important. And if you just look at the pictures here, these people still look distinctly Arab, not really Southeast Asian. So there is a sort of an Arab aristocracy, Muslim aristocracy, present also on Java. This has led to, a certain way of distinguishing the different types of religiosity on Java, which has been transposed sometimes a bit uncarefully onto the Muslims of not only Java or Indonesia, even of Southeast Asia. The people I talked about so far are pious, observant Muslims, and the term used on Java for these people is santri. and sometimes also putihan, which means the white ones, a term that is also used for them on Sumatra. These are people indeed who are really committed to Islam. They are the ones who try and make Hajj and travel around the Indian Ocean if they have the means to learn about Islam. They're usually located in the coastal areas, in urban centers, and often indeed involved in commerce with the Muslim world. But the vast majority, until quite recently, of in particular Javanese Muslims are called Abana. They're sort of normal Muslims, but they're not very observant. These are originally categories that are specifically meant for Java, but there has been a bit of a tendency to apply it to Muslims across Southeast Asia to sort of, characterize the distinctions in how committed they are to Islam. It is often combined with a term that actually has nothing to do with Islam per se. It's not even formally a religious category because it refers to the court culture of the aristocracies and the sultanates throughout the Indonesian archipelago. These people are called the priyayi. And there's been a bit of a tendency to extrapolate from this Javanese taxonomy for Muslims onto the wider Muslim area. You find this term is very often used in the literature on Southeast Asia, but it's important to bear in mind that it's actually only accurate when you talk about the Javanese situation. It does not really apply to the other islands of Indonesia, let alone to what it was British Malaya or the southern Philippines and Thailand. Now we're going to move quickly to the modern era and on our way to contemporary Islam. Islam also has functioned as a means of resistance, and illustrations of that can be found in colonial times, when what is now Indonesia was sort of gradually forged into the Netherlands, East Indies. And I'll talk very, very briefly about three conflicts: the Padri Wars in the island of Sumatra, in the southern parts of that island, the Java War, self-explanatory, and the Aceh War of the late 19th century. What they have in common is that they started actually as challenges to internal indigenous power structures, but they then morphed into Islamically inspired opposition to the colonization of the Indies by the Dutch. If we look at the Padri Wars that took place in the area marked in black, it's inhabited by an ethnic group known as the Minangkabau. Now the Minangkabau have, since the Padri Wars, always had a reputation of being fiercely Muslim, very Islamic. But the Padri Wars started out as a challenge by Islamic reformists, so people who had visited the Middle East, and we are in the early 19th century. We have Hajis returning from Mecca and Medina, which was then occupied by what we call the Wahhabis, the predecessor of present-day Saudi Arabia. So the atmosphere in Mecca and Medina was very different in the early 19th century from the centuries before. And these people came back home and they wanted to change everything about Minangkabau culture. Because one of the distinguishing marks of Minangkabau culture is that it is matrilineal and the power structures are organized accordingly. That runs counter to a sort of the patriarchal orientation of proper Muslim societies. So these reformers wanted to do away with this kafir type of social organization, which they considered un-Islamic. But there was in the background also going on a competition between Sufi orders. You had the Shattariya order, which was very much in favor of that unity of being doctrine of Ibn al-Arabi, and they're being challenged by a Naqshbandi order, mainly associated with the Turkish parts of the Muslim world, but very much advocating that soberer kind of Sufism. So there is that complexity added to the mix as well, and we're also talking about blatantly about economic interests. The area is rich in gold. You can also grow coffee there. So there was an interest among smaller traders to take away the monopolies over coffee and gold from the clan leaders and matrilineal power brokers in the region. Yeah, so it's a complex picture. And what happens is that, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So the local rulers appealed to the Dutch. We have trouble here, help us. Because guess what? We only can guarantee the supply of coffee and gold, not these firebrand Muslims. Okay? But it led to the rise of Imam Bonjol, one of the prime Padri leaders. That's the name that was used for these Muslim reformists and firebrands. And he was a sort of the key leader who held out the longest until he was eventually defeated by the Dutch and sent into internal exile in the Netherlands Indies. Java were a comparable story, but different in the sense that here we have the last instance where somebody from the Priyari class, the aristocracy associated with the courts on Java, led an uprising against the Dutch, namely in the person of Diponegoro, a prince of the Yogyakarta royal lineage, who was actually a committed Muslim and thought that his uncles and cousins were actually not governing according to Islamic principles, and he thought he could do it much better. They were making common cause with the Dutch. Kufar, how can this be? And he presented himself as the Ratu Adil, the just king. Ratu is a Javanese word, but Adil is the Arabic word for just. Yeah? An interesting syncretic term. He met the same fate. He led an uprising for about 5 years, was eventually defeated and captured. You can see on this painting. This is the very first, also a little bit of art history, this is the first sort of modern Western style way of painting by an Indonesian. It was done by a relative of Diponegoro, who actually picked us in here with the government general clock, telling him to get in that carriage and spend the rest of his life in Fort Rotterdam in Celebes, Sulawesi. Aceh War, this is the Dutch Vietnam. The Dutch were never able to subjugate this fiercely independent and staunchly Islamic sultanate in northern Sumatra, and they have their own local hero in the person of Teuku Umar. Teuku Umar, Diponegoro, and also Imam Bonjol have been added to the pantheon of Indonesian national heroes, even though they predate the actual independence story. They're on banknotes and stuff like that. They are honored also in post-independence Indonesia. What is in the background of this is that bigger struggle that is affecting the wider Muslim world between traditionalist and reformist Islam. Traditional Islam and traditional Islamic learning associated with the holy cities, Mecca and Medina, and this reformist Islam concentrating very much at Al-Azhar in Egypt from the late 19th century onwards. So Indonesia is not immune to these larger patterns of say, religious dispute and debate affecting the wider Muslim world. It just is coined in, to give it a bit of local flavor, in its own language. The traditionalist Muslims are often referred to as kaum tua, the old folk, the old-fashioned ones, and of course that is a term used by the reformists who like to call themselves the kaum muda, the new people, the modern ones. Yeah? And that divide has colored Indonesia ever since and remains relevant until today. Because one of the key features that also starts to become important in late colonial times, we're now in the early 20th century, but an institution arises in Indonesia that has survived until today and which very much shapes how Islam is practiced, experienced, studied and taught in Indonesia today. The Islamic mass organizations, organisasi massa, and Indonesians love acronyms, so they call it Ormas. One of the oldest one, I find it one of the more fascinating ones, the Sarekat Islam, the Union of Islam. It actually started as a sort of trade union of batik merchants. You know batik, the painted cotton fabrics for which Indonesia and wider Southeast Asia is famous. But it morphed very quickly into a Muslim emancipatory movement. These people were quite well educated, as you can tell, that that this is a sort of members' assembly, but they used the Dutch word, Ledenvergadering. So these people did have contacts with the colonial administration, but there was a left-leaning tendency. Its first chairman, Djokovic Noto, who was a minor aristocrat from Java, even wrote a book on Islam and socialism. Very interesting. That was given short thrift later on by Haji Adu Salim, who became a key figure in the Sarikat Islam in the 1930s and 40s and basically expelled all the leftists from the Sarikat Islam and turned it into more of a right-wing organization. But this was the very first Islamic organization established in Indonesia. We are in 1911. Yeah? Sarikat Islam eventually collapsed due to infighting and internal rivalries, but a few other ones are still around today. We have the Muhammadiyah, founded in 1912 in Yogyakarta, which is a modernist Muslim organization, very much inspired by the thinking of Muhammad Abdu in Cairo. It was founded, interesting, by a man called Ahmed Dahlan, who was actually the imam of the Sultan's mosque. How establishment can you get? But he was very much inspired by what he learned from his study trips to Cairo. A more Puritan organization is the Persatuan Islam. They are more associated, say, with the ideas of Rashid Rida in his later years, when he became very much charmed by what was happening in Saudi Arabia. So they're much more Puritan. Interestingly, it was established by an expatriate, a Tamil from Singapore, who later became known as Hassan Bandu. And then finally, the traditionalists, whom I mentioned at the beginning of my talk already briefly, felt they had to respond. There were all these threats from Puritan reformists, modernists of the Muhammad Abdu ilk. The Nahdlatul Ulama still consider themselves the heirs of the Prophet. We are the proper Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the people of the community and of the tradition. So the Nahdlatul Ulama, the renaissance of the Ulama, was established in 1926 by a man called Hashim Ash'ari. Now what makes these organizations interesting is that they not only predate much better-known organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or Jamaat al-Islami in Pakistan by decades, they also dwarf these organizations in the numbers of adherents or followings they can mobilize. In the case of the Muhammadiyah and the Nahdlatul Ulama, we're talking about 40 million people each. Yeah, that's massive. Moving on then to Islam in independent Indonesia. The Dutch had always been tolerant of organizations like Muhammad and Nahdlatul Ulama because they strived to emancipate Muslims through education and da'wah, religious propagation. The Dutch were very unforgiving for any attempts to turn Islam into a political tool. They had a good security apparatus and an intelligence service and a police force that would repress these things without mercy. The Japanese, during World War II, when they occupied Indonesia for about 3-4 years, had a different view. They thought they could mobilize the Muslims and organize them politically for their own purposes. And they set up an organization which was called the Majlis Shura Muslim Indonesia, which means the Consultative Council of Indonesian Muslims, abbreviated to MASHUI. It sounds very Japanese, but it's not a Japanese term. It is basically a Malay acronym. After the Japanese left, MASHUI continued and became the first Islamic political party. It developed into an umbrella organization because, people from the Muhammadiyah, the Persatuan Islam, and Nahdlatul Ulama, they all joined this party. And it was also led by somebody from the Persatuan Islam, so somebody with a rather Puritan attitude named Muhammad Natsir, who was the linchpin of Islamic party politics in the first decade of Indonesian independence. Now MASHUI, because of its Puritan attitude, after independence was declared, made an effort to get a reference to Islam, and in particular Islamic law, included into the preamble of the Constitution in 1945. And that text is formally known as the Piagam Jakarta or the Jakarta Charter, but it is often referred to as the 7 words because in Malay the expression consists of 7 words. They wanted a reference in the Constitution that Muslims in Indonesia would have to abide by Sharia, by Islamic law. The secularist nationalists who had the political upper hand, they declared independence in the person of the founding president Sukarno, and his vice president was a Muslim, but a person who advocated a secular political organization, thought this was dangerous. This was divisive in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country like Indonesia. So they came up with an alternative, which is known as the Pancasila doctrine, the doctrine of 5 principles, which is the sort of the safeguard to maintain what has become Indonesia's national slogan, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, unity and diversity. The same slogan as the United States has on its flag. Pancasila, as I said, is 5 principles. I'm not going to go into 2, 3, 4, and 5. What interests us today is number 1. There's a mandatory belief in one God. I'm cheating a little bit. The term God is not really used in that sense. The expression is Ketuhanan Yang Maha Esa, which means basically something like a supreme being. And it means that all Indonesians, not only Muslims, but also Protestants, Catholics, Hindu Buddhists, Confucianists, and Taoists, have to subscribe to that principle. And by calling it not Allah or God, but supreme being, the proponents of the Pancasila doctrine reasoned no Indonesians should have a problem with that, and it would, keep the social fabric of Indonesia together. So what it is important to realize is that this measure, this decision, it is not a prohibition of Islam. It's an attempt of the government to exercise control over religion. It's very similar to what happened to Turkey under Atatürk, where you also had a situation that a new state has to be formed. You have to create a sense of belonging, solidarity, and cohesion among the people. Religion was considered in most instances potentially a divisive factor if you would play religious identity politics. Well, the way to avoid that is not to ban religion, it is to bring it under government control. And it's no coincidence that with Turkey having its Diyanet, Indonesia has a massive Ministry of Religion and a bureaucracy who administers the religious interests of the Indonesian people. And for people with religious upbringings and educations, this is also job opportunities. These ministries also need to be staffed. Yeah? So there is a double benefit for the government. You control and can avoid the politicization of Islam in particular, because it's a majority Muslim country, and at the same time you create a bureaucracy where people find employment. So if we looked at it, Indonesia, it is a majority Muslim country, it's not an Islamic state. And efforts have been made since independence to avoid that at all costs. It leaves some very difficult questions. Then, how do we do this? We need a legal system as well, and the majority of the people is Muslim, and Sharia is so central to Islamic learning. How do we do that? Well, there is 2 scholars, legal scholars from Muslim backgrounds, who have made attempts to find some kind of an accommodation. One is Hasbi as-Siddiqui, who comes from Aceh, and the other one is Hazairan, who is somebody from Sumatra. Hasbi as-Siddiqui had a sort of a traditional Islamic upbringing. Hazairan not so much. He was actually an expert on customary law, adat, which was very much used by the colonial administration of the Dutch to use a sort of local practices as sources of law rather than Islamic law. And in the colonial time that made great sense. It was a sort of a divide and rule practice, that if you have regional people adhering to their own legal systems, you avoid that, the possibility that they all band together under the banner of Islam and rise up against the colonial authorities. Hazairan, in his early education, had specialized in the adat of the people of Renjang in western Java. But later on, they came to the conclusion we have to find some kind of accommodation, and attempts are made actually to create a sort of an Indonesian fiqh. Fiqh is the actual Islamic discipline of Islamic legal learning, jurisprudence, you could call it. So we have to actually develop a sort of a fiqh Indonesia, Indonesian Islamic jurisprudence, which is sensitive to the cultural setting in which we operate. Hazairim used a slightly different term, but again, with a reference clearly to traditional Islamic learning. The mazhab, that is the term for a traditional Islamic school of law. 4 have survived in the Sunni world. But we have to create our own. And one that is suitable for post-colonial Indonesia. This has remained largely an academic exercise. It never really took off, but on a theoretical level, it has been important among Indonesians who sort of, try to theorize the possibility of an Indonesian Islamic law. It's just that the state really curbed the possibilities of developing this any further. But at least attempts have been made on an intellectual level to find ways of that if it cannot be in the Constitution, how could we accommodate it then into our societies? Because, we don't stop being Muslims. And that was a sort of the reasoning behind this. Some people were much less willing to compromise. Masyumi had to admit defeat, that they failed in getting the Jakarta Charter adopted as a preamble of the Constitution, but some other Muslim activists refused to give in and surrender. And one organization was called Darul Islam. And they actually tried to set up an Islamic state. They proclaimed it even on the back of the independence, after the independence war against the Netherlands finally ended in 1949, they decided to proclaim an Islamic state. This is ISIS avant la lettre. Yeah. But they were considered renegades and they only controlled pockets of territory in southern Sumatra, West Java, and certain areas of South Sulawesi. But eventually they lost out, and the leader, Kartus Suwiryo, who had been a member even of Sarekat Islam in his younger years, was arrested and summarily executed by the government. Muslim politicians found themselves increasingly in hot water. I mean, the fact that an organization like Darul Islam was around made the government very suspicious of any political activism among Muslims. So, I mean, although they're praying here together, Sukarno and Nasser really fell out in the late 50s when Sukarno got his own ideas what democracy meant. It basically meant everybody had to listen to him. And he called that guided democracy, with him as guide. And Masyumi party was dissolved and basically banned on the political scene. But Sukarno's days were numbered as well. He became increasingly left-leaning. And in 1965, the assassination of a number of very senior military officials by communists or alleged communists was used by the military to say that there was a larger communist conspiracy and that Sukarno was implicated in that. So there was a coup d'etat. This is how you spell it in Indonesian. And it was led by, until then, a rather obscure logistics officer by the name of Suharto, who then gradually muscled Sukarno out and established the new order, the Orde Baru regime, which stayed in place for the next few decades. And its relationship with Islam was complex. Islam in public life from the 60s onwards becomes increasingly interesting, but also very difficult to disentangle and to determine what is exactly the relation of the regime with the Muslim segment of the population. I use the term that the regime gives mixed signals, and I'm being kind here. Let me give you some examples. There's two key periods I think you can identify where this becomes manifestly clear. In the late 60s, early 70s, and in the decade from 83 till 1993. What happened in those two periods? Well, the two key Muslim actors between 68 and 75, so we were in the early New Order years, were an intellectual trained at McGill University in Canada, Abdul Mukhti Ali, who went actually to Canada to become a scholar of Islam. Sounds a bit strange. In the past, they would go to the Middle East and study at Islamic universities. This man wanted to become an academic scholar of religion. He's the first person with a PhD in comparative religious studies in Indonesia. He studied with Wilfred Campbell Smith, very famous historian of religion and Islam in particular. And he became an important academic, a professor, then a rector of Islamic universities, and eventually he was tapped on the shoulder by Suharto, would you like to become Minister of Religion? And Mufti Ali agreed. The other person is somebody of a younger generation, Nuholis Majid, who in the same time frame became the chairman of the largest Muslim student union, the HMI, Himpunan Mahasiswa Islam. It was a kind of an independent Muslim student union because it was not tied to the Muhammadiyah or the Nahdlatul Ulama. It had members from both constituencies. There were traditional and modernist Muslims within HMI. Now the main feat of Mufti Ali is the development and expansion of an Islamic higher education sector based on what he had learned in Canada. It becomes really a very scholarly way of studying Islam. The curriculum that used to be based on the Al-Azhar curriculum, which was still very traditional, with only the traditional Islamic disciplines being taught, Quran commentaries, Hadith studies, Islamic law, things like that. Now, people actually started to engage with Islam through social sciences, what could be learned from the humanities, and the rest, theology. A lot of people went to study actual theology in Europe, America, Australia, not to become Christian, but because they thought the toolbox of Christian theologians was very sophisticated, and they could use it for their own purposes. Yeah? And the driving force behind that was Mufti Ali, who saw the advantage of that. The state supported that, and there is now a whole network of state Islamic universities in all major cities in Indonesia. The role of Nuholis Majid, the student leader, was a little bit more provocative. He's a student after all. People first thought he would become the new Muhammad Nasser. He was a charismatic figure. They thought if anybody has a chance to convince Suharto to allow the re-establishment of Maashumi, it's this guy. And then he shocked friend and foe by saying, well, we may need Islam, but we don't need Islamic parties. So he was very quickly disowned by the former Maashumi politicians and called a traitor and accommodationist who was sucking up to the military regime. But actually, there was a much more sophisticated side to this, aside from that provocative slogan he used. He actually tried to demonstrate to Indonesians that modernizing societies, they will all secularize. And it's a social process, he said. You have to distinguish it carefully of secularism, because an ism is an ideology. All modernizing societies go through that process. It does not mean westernization, we will do it in our own way, but he said there is a religious domain to everybody's life, and there is a political domain, which basically is confined to how we get along as people among each other. The connection with upstairs, that is between each and every individual Muslim and God. I'll not go into the details. He develops, I think, a quite convincing argument, using also very much Islamic terminology to demonstrate that it is not something alien to Muslims. But just for the reasons of time, I leave it only as this sort of, I hope, teasing expression. I said that the regime gives mixed signals, aside from the sort of, these accommodationist people who actually wanted to work with the new order regime, who had a very strong agenda of economic development. Because Indonesia's economy had been left in tatters by Sukarno. And Suharto really needed everybody on board to help him rebuild the economy. And there were Indonesian Muslim professionals and technocrats who sort of agreed with Mufti Ali and Nuholis Majid to work with the regime. Some other people wanted to keep a distance, but strangely enough, the New Order regime did allow some space for these people. And one instance was that they allowed the formation of the Dewan Dakwah Islamiyah Indonesia, the Indonesian Islamic Propagation Council, led by Muhammad Nasir, who had now been freed from jail. But you see the bad news, we will not allow you to rebuild a shubi, but you can have this DDII to play with and do your Puritan Islamic stuff there. It did gain quite some traction, not at these state Islamic universities, but at more technical and scientifically oriented institutions like the Institute of Technology in Bandung and the Agricultural Institute in Bogor. So people who are going for professional careers, not people in the social sciences and the humanities. They also set up a sort of a pseudo-state institution called the Council of Indonesian Ulama, Religious Scholars, abbreviated. Indonesian is Majelis Ulama Indonesia, so it's called MUI. And in charge, the first chairman of that organization was Hamka, Indonesia's Muslim man of letters, very famous writer, probably the most influential Muslim writer in the 20th century, and he was made the first chairperson of that organization. In the 1980s, that other period I talked about, 83-93 as an episode of mixed signals, on the one hand, the government becomes suddenly very forceful about reintroducing the Pancasila as what they call asas tunggal, the only ideological foundation. All political and social actors in Indonesia had to subscribe to Pancasila, including organizations like Muhammadiyah and NU. If you didn't, you were considered to be clandestine and you had to disband. So Muslim activists had to walk a very tightrope to, not upset the government. And once again, I think it is a demonstration that the regime wants to reaffirm the recognized religions, Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. Atheism is not an option in Indonesia, also not in the reaffirmation of Pancasila. You have to pick one of these religious traditions. And the government was very serious about it. And yet, at the same time, something special was being done for the Muslims. It was called the reactualisatie agenda, the reactualization agenda. And it was presided over by the then Minister of Religious Affairs, Munar Shadzali, who had actually been a career diplomat most of his life and a trained political scientist. He presided over the implementation of the reactualization agenda. And it consisted very much of the introduction and the promotion of a culturally sensitive Indonesian Islam. A lot of books appeared with titles like Islam Cultural. Some people talked even about civil Islam. It was sort of not political, but civil society Islam. And the leader of the Nahdlatul Ulama at the time even wrote a book called Cosmopolitan Islam. And the mainstays of this were these state Islamic universities, which were expanded hugely in the 80s and 90s, drawing on the financial windfall which Indonesia had made thanks to the oil boom of the 70s and 80s. Not only Saudi Arabia has been sinking money into a religious state policy, also Indonesia expanded the campuses of these universities. This is the one in Jakarta. It's pretty impressive, with university hospitals, massive mosques, of course, you have to build that as well. But alongside there was also an enormous scholarship program where people in the hundreds, if not in the thousands, were sent abroad for advanced degrees in the study of Islam. Not only in the Muslim world, but very much also at universities like McGill, Leiden, ANU, Cornell, Hamburg, even in Germany. It became really a sort of a seedbed for the next generation of Muslim intellectuals. There was also room for private initiative. Nugulus Majid is by then the immense grise of Muslim intellectualism, he sets up his own think tank, his own foundation, the Yayasan Para Madinah, which also, because Nurholis Majid knew very well from which side his bread was buttered, he also did workshops in 5-star hotels for the top brass of the military and the New Order regime, because more and more people started to play up their own Islamic credentials. He even set up a private university eventually, and the government jumped on the bandwagon also. It set up an association of Muslim intellectuals in Indonesia under the personal patronage of Suharto. This became a sort of the government think tank, bringing Muslim intellectuals, not only people working on religion, but people with Muslim backgrounds, to help the government with policy making. And eventually Suharto became Muhammad Suharto and made Hajj in 1990, and that actually capped off that whole process, which in Indonesian is known as penghijauan. They have a sense of humor in Indonesia. It means greening, but it does not only refer to the symbolic color of Islam, which is green. Prophet's mantle, all mosques have always green neon lights. It also refers, of course, to the military, where the top brass is also playing up its Islamic credentials. As I said briefly, there is also Indonesia becomes more Islamic. It's still Islam with a smiling face, but you get also the commodification. You know, the TV preachers like Jim, Islamic Sheikh, and one of the rectors of the State Islamic University in Jakarta even wrote a book on the spiritual side of golf. I understand he loves playing golf with government ministers, so if you can give that a bit of a Sufi twist, why not? We're in Indonesia, it's all a bit happier and relaxing. But it was too little, too late. 1998, there is an organization, the Action Platform of Muslim Students, who basically start to push out Suharto. He wants to run for a second term. The people have had it. They don't want him anymore. Now you see the importance growing of Muslim intellectuals and leaders of Islamic mass organizations, because Nurholis Majid is actually the key figure who negotiates a peaceful transition of power. He goes and sees Suharto and tells him, look, we're going to have bloodshed here, it's going to go completely out of hand, we'll have a repeat of 1965, and it's time to go. So he persuades Suharto to hand over power. In the first instance, regime change means that Suharto steps down, and his confidant and Minister of Technology, B.J. Habibie, becomes the interim president. But in the first free elections in 1999, he loses. And I think we see something pretty unique in the Muslim world. We now enter the era that is now known as Reformation, and we see that the then chairman of the Nahdlatul Ulama, Abdurrahman Wahid, grandson of the founder of the NU, and the leader of the Mohammedia, Amin Rais, take the highest offices in the land. Abdurrahman Wahid becomes the first elected president of Indonesia, freely and fairly elected president, because Suharto was also always elected. And Amin Rais becomes the speaker of the Consultative Council. So the two leaders of the two largest Muslim mass organizations assume political power through peaceful, democratic means. But there is something interesting about it. They get these jobs on a personal title. And that is the topic I address mostly in this book, because now we get a sort of indeed a contest for society, ideas and values, and Indonesia is again, I think, a very instructive example for regime changes elsewhere in the Muslim world, both in a sort of a positive and an encouraging sense, but there is also sobering lessons to be learned. Islam imposed Suharto Indonesia. I will talk briefly here about, I'll map briefly the Muslim intellectual scene, and also identify some of the key issues that have been preoccupying Muslims since then, since 1999, and also put them at loggerheads with each other in many instances. And I think we can also make a distinction now, letting go of these terms like Sandli, Abangan, and Priyagi. I prefer, I'm a scholar, I come up with my own taxonomy. I think it's better to talk about traditionalists or socially conservative, progressive, and reactionary Muslims. And in the course of the Reformation era, we see an increasingly tense standoff between progressives and reactionaries within the Muslim camp. On the reactionary side, the price you pay for opening up the political arena is also that you will have to tolerate, to a degree, you should not break the law, voices you do not like. And when there was a sort of a momentary breakdown of law and order in the immediate transition of 1998-99, clashes erupted at various places in Indonesia with precarious demographic relations, in particular in areas where there was, a large presence of other religions, like in the Eastern Islands, where it's almost like 50-50 between Muslims and Christians. And a situation close to civil war erupted in these areas, and a Muslim militia was formed, Laskar Jihad, who was actually sent to the Eastern Islands to fight the Christians there. And also you get a sort of vigilante organizations that start to emerge, like Front Pembela Islam, FPI in Indonesia. It's the Islamic Defenders Front, which still makes its voice heard a lot in the present. Laskar Jihad has disbanded post 9/11, post Bali bombings. It became a little bit too dangerous to have a Muslim militia. You drew too much attention from the security forces. But FPI still exists and creates time and time again havoc in Indonesia. So this is a sort of the sinister side of reactionary Islam in Indonesia, which you sort of have to tolerate, and which is often also a litmus test of how robust the democratization process is. Sometimes it gets out of control because we have also this organization Jamaat al-Islamiyah, which is an overtly jihadi organization. Abu Bakr Bashir, in his early years, was a member of that Darul Islam organization of Kartu Suwiryo, who spent a long time in exile and only dared to come back in the relative openness of post-Suharto Indonesia. And that's the people who were involved in the Bali bombings, among other things. On the other side of the spectrum, the progressive side, you see that Nahdlatul Ulama in particular reinventing itself as an organization that really wants to position itself squarely in favor of democratization, and you see the rise of a group of new ulama. I mean, they're getting on in age now a bit, 20 years on, but within Nahdlatul Ulama, these two people are sort of the shining lights of a very fresh approach to engaging with the Islamic tradition. And now that they have sort of matured, they have risen to top positions within the Nahdlatul Ulama. Said Akil Siraj was the person who proclaimed that Jakarta Declaration I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. And Master Masudi has always had a huge following among younger NU members because of the ideas he expounds. The youngest generation of traditionalist Muslims then came up with something even more adventurous and bold, the notion of Islamic post-traditionalism. The poster boy of that is, first of all, Ahmed Basso, who used the term for the translation of a set of essays by a Moroccan philosopher, Muhammad Abd al-Jabri, who had engaged in a very fierce critique of Islamic thinking and trying to excavate the rationalist philosophical heritage of the Muslim tradition. And people like Ahmed Basso were very charmed by that, and they thought we have to translate this from Arabic into Indonesian, and Indonesian Muslims should read that. The term actually stuck, and now these people are called Islamic post-traditionalists. They take it as a badge of honor, and it's often abbreviated in Indonesian into POSTA. The other person involved very closely with that, and the first one who sort of wrote a self-reflective study on it, it was his PhD, was about this phenomenon, Islamic post-traditionalism. He was called Rumari. So now you have actually in the traditionalist Muslim organization people you would sort of associate with being conservative and dealing with petrified, centuries-old Islamic learning, actually developing some of the freshest, most interesting ideas that you can find, not only in Indonesia, I would dare say, throughout the Muslim world. Humani's book has even been translated into English, which is still relatively rare for writings by Indonesian Muslims. There is a counterpart also among the modernist Muslims. They sort of felt they were being passed by the traditionalists in terms of progressive thinking. So they developed their own organization, the network of young Muhammadiyah intellectuals, centered around the Ma'arif Institute for Culture and Humanity, and that refers to the then chairman of the Muhammadiyah, who became like the mentor of that network, together with two other members of the presidium of the Muhammadiyah. It did not go down that well with all other Muhammadiyah leaders. There were also people who were much more conservative, even reactionary within the Muhammadiyah, and they didn't like the sponsorship of Shafi'i, Amin and Munir of these youngsters. And I told you Indonesians are creative and have a sense of humor. They made an acronym of the first letters of the names of these people and called them Babam Sam, Uncle Sam. And like they were sort of Americanizing Indonesian society. And that's of course a very powerful accusation. And how Islamic is this still? What is going on here? Yeah. So these are very contested ideas. They're controversial. Not all Muslims rally behind this. At the same time, I know of no other Muslim country where these ideas are not only developed, but also do get public space. Contested, but you know, you can do this stuff. In Egypt, even in Tunisia, Morocco, I'm not so sure if you could go as far as what Islamic post-traditionalists or the members of JIM, as it is called in Indonesian, are proposing in Indonesia. Some push it even further. There is a liberal Islam network, JIL, and it is set up by, well, two friends, but one of an Anu background and one of a modernist background. These guys are as rowdy and confrontational as their reactionary opponents. So they have not made friends in the Muslim bloc, and they are unabashedly in favor of neoliberalism and having a democracy built on those principles. They think even Pancasila is too conservative and creating more obstacles than what is needed in a country like Indonesia. Now the key battlegrounds, I probably have to hurry up a bit, we don't have much time left. The key themes where reactionaries and progressives are battling it out is in the domain of politics, Islam, statehood and democracy, in the field of Islamic law, and in the domain of freedom of religion. If you look at the political domain, in post-Suharto Indonesia there was, well, Islamic parties mushroomed. And they were from openly Islamist to parties who just were like, called it a Muslim equivalent of Christian Democrats. Yeah, the people were Muslim, but their ideologies were not geared towards setting up an Islamic state. But if you look at this whole plethora of Islamic parties, they did not get much of the electoral vote, you know. All put together, they never made the 30% threshold. And that is an interesting contrast with the personal popularity I mentioned earlier of people like Amin Rais and Abdurrahman Wahid. They really got elected on a personal title as respected leaders of Muslim mass organizations. That means actually that the Indonesian Muslim electorate is quite sophisticated. They can make that distinction. We have people we trust who lead Muslim mass organizations which are overtly not political, but we don't need Islamic parties. Nurulus Majid got what he wanted, you know, because in elections they don't do very well. Some parties, in particular the Islamist one, in particular the Crescent Moon Party and the Justice and Prosperity Party, we actually heard these names before, yeah? Again, copycatting was going on. It was not the Muslim Brotherhood invented these names, or even the AK Party. The Indonesians were first. Yeah, yeah, they tried to revive the Jakarta Charter, but they failed. People realized this is too dangerous. That Pancasila thing suits us just fine. There's other groups like Hizbut Tahrir, which has an Indonesian branch, who want something entirely different. They think, let's bring back the caliphate. Now, this is mainly a sort of a utopian exercise, like it is in many other places, of a sort of university students doing fancy political theorizing. I mean, there's quite a lot of following among university students, but it's not a realistic political agenda for Indonesia. Most people talk in these terms that, you know, yes, we can have a secular state, maybe some accommodation of religion, but the political domain is politics, and that has to do with, you know, governing people in their interhuman relations, and religion is religion. You know, you keep it separate from the institutions of the state. Islamic law, a similar story going on. There you have, you know, debates whether we go for the latter or the spirit of law, including Islamic law. And those who go for the latter, having failed to get it in the constitution, try something else. They call it Shariatization from below. You know, if you cannot have it imposed by the national state, they look for other means. And other people look more for an ethical interpretation, the spirit of the Sharia. And there is actually a discipline within Islamic learning known as Maqasid al-Sharia, the higher objectives of Sharia, call it the equivalent of a philosophy of law, but then Islam style. And they think that suffices, that the Sharia provides us with a moral compass, an ethical guideline, and you can enshrine that in secular legislation. There's no problem there. What I mean with Shariatization from below is a ruse that is used by reactionaries and conservatives. On the back of the democratization of Indonesia, there was also, for the first time, an attempt to look at efficiency. And if you have an island state of 13,000 islands, it actually makes perfect sense to think and consider decentralization of the government administration. And with that, a devolution of political power from the national government in Jakarta to regional, provincial and local authorities. Now that was of course a laudable initiative, makes perfect sense, you know, government closer to the people, you can't be against that. But it was a sort of abused by Muslim activists to say, wait a minute, if we can't have Islamic law in the constitution, then we will do it on a local level. And the name for that in Indonesia is Peraturan Syariat, regional or local bylaws through which they try to introduce Islamic law. And it has been partially successful in staunchly Islamic regions like Aceh, Banten, and again certain parts of South Sulawesi. It's probably no coincidence that this is also the places where you find secessionists in the case of Aceh, or areas that were in the past hotbeds of Darul Islam activism. And the other people, well, they developed this Maqasidi thinking. This is sort of the thinking of Sharia in ethical terms. One of the key theorists internationally is Jasser Auda, a Canadian Egyptian scholar, whose work has even been translated into Indonesian, but they also have their own philosopher of Islamic law, Julian Wahyudi, who has also written books on Maqasid and Sharia in Indonesian. We come to the end of it, and you know, there's a lot of interesting things, encouraging things going on in Indonesia since 1999. 2005, it gets a bit tricky. I've called it a watershed year, but not in a positive sense. First of all, there was the proclamation of a series of fatwas by MUI, that Council of Religious Scholars of Indonesia, which has a tendency to be quite conservative, if not reactionary. Notoriously, there was the fatwa number 7, where the notions of pluralism, liberalism, and secularism were deemed un-Islamic, without actually clearly defining what these terms meant and what was un-Islamic about it. Even more problematic was fatwa number 3, which is really, a challenge of the Panchasila doctrine. It was that, they said Muslims should not take part in collective interfaith prayers. If all the religious groups were together, there should not be an imam, praying alongside Christians. If he is allowed to do, an Islamic supplication, that's okay. But not some ecumenical, I'm okay, you're okay thing with a priest and a Hindu guru and things like that. They didn't want that. And this is the really problematic one. Fatwa number 11, where the Ahmadi become a target of basically a fatwa, and they are pushed beyond the pale. I know they're controversial elsewhere in the Muslim world as well, that there's debates whether Ahmadis are Muslims, or are they something like the Baha'is, a spin-off, and they should be recognized as something separate from Islam, notwithstanding that Ahmadis want to be recognized as Muslims. But if you have a fatwa against that by a quasi-government institution like MUI, it gets dangerous. And that's what happened. FPI went for these people. Shia Sesat. Sesat is the Indonesian word for deviant, or radical. And the same happened with the Ahmadis, and even with, say, run-of-the-mill mainstream Muslims who spoke up for Shia Muslims or Ahmadis. I have friends who are active in these platforms for religious freedom, and he said, I am 100% in disagreement with Ahmadis in what they believe, but I'm 200% behind them that they have the right to believe that. And there's Muslims who have spoken up for that, and they were also beaten up at rallies by vigilantes like the FPI. So, it's not always plain sailing in Indonesia, and it was certainly not helped that in the same year, 2005, there was a conservative turn in the Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama top leadership. People like Ma'arif disappeared as chairman, and this person came in, notwithstanding that he has a PhD from the University of Santa Barbara in political science. He is very reactionary, but he's a powerful man. For 10 years he was the chairman of the Muhammadiyah, but he doubled also as one of the top figures in that fatwa council. And the same is true even in the Nahdlatul Ulama. Although Ma'aruf Amin had to wait until last year before he became the general president of the NU, he was the chairperson of the drafting committee of the fatwas, and for 10 years, during the presidency of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, SBA for short, next to Malaysia, he was very influential. The president, unfortunately, made a statement at one occasion where he said that he was taking his cues on things Islamic from Ma'aruf Amin rather than from his own Minister of Religious Affairs. A very strange statement for the president to make, because it basically undermines one of his own cabinet members. This did not help the progressives in Indonesia. It was a real setback, and it was a very tense decade that started in 2005 with these kind of people in charge in the mass organizations, with the shadow of these fatwas hanging over Muslim minority communities. And progressives have tried to respond, they wrote books like, this is basically the same book in English and in Indonesian, but the titles are slightly different. In English it's called Interfaith Theology, but actually if you translate the Indonesian literally, it's Interfaith Jurisprudence. It's a very interesting difference they have chosen there. There is also self-appointed watchdogs like the Wahid Institute, which actually monitors human rights abuses and threats to religious freedom in Indonesia. It's founded by Yani Wahid, the daughter of Abdurrahman Wahid, and staffed by Ahmed Humadi, one of the Islamic post-traditionalists, and Ahmed Su'edi, also a human rights activist. They write annual reports about, say, the situation and the state of affairs of religious freedom in Indonesia. And since 2005, these have been very depressing reports. I'm going to end on a positive note. 2015-16, maybe another turning point, because that's when, at the National Congresses in the summer of 2015, the Nahdlatul Ulama and the Muhammadiyah published two books. Islam Nusantara was written by young cadres of the Nahdlatul Ulama, wherein indeed this Indonesian, or actually Southeast Asian Islam is presented as something that is, culturally sensitive, capable of dealing with religious plurality and displaying the right levels of toleration. And within the Muhammadiyah, sort of the modernist counterpart of the NU, young intellectuals published a similar book. Their title is basically a pun on the national slogan of Indonesia, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, and they call it then Bhinneka Fiqh. Yeah? Islamic law that respects what is said in the Pancasila, yeah? Which celebrates religious plurality. And that indeed became also the inspiration for what I started with, that gathering in Jakarta in May 2016, when the NU convened a conference, an international summit even of moderate Islamic leaders, Sunni and Shia alike. And it brought, people of very different backgrounds together. And on the photo at the top you see the chairman of the Nahdlatul Ulama, Akil Siraj, former President Megawati Sukarno Putri. The smiling guy is Vice President Yusuf Kala. And then even, although he looks not too happy and comfortable, Maruf Amin, the General President of the Nahdlatul Ulama. Yeah? So, conservative reactionaries, political leaders, and progressives sort of all endorsed this conference, and that is where indeed the declaration of the Nahdlatul Ulama was presented, and it's a 16-point statement where they explain why they think it's a good idea that Muslims elsewhere in the world take notice of this Islam Nusantara, not as an export commodity, but as something that could inspire them to develop their own culturally sensitive Islams. And with that, I'm coming full circle. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kersten, for this very rich and colorful presentation about Islam in Indonesia. Now it's time for debate and for questions. If any person is interested in asking a brief question, please come here. Everyone come here. Professor Legrand has a microphone.
Thank you. Willy Fautré, Human Rights Without Frontiers. Thank you very much for that very rich lecture about the history and the contemporary situation in Indonesia. You addressed a lot of issues. There are two that I would like you to clarify a little bit. The blasphemy laws in Indonesia, what is their origin and what's it? The blasphemy laws.
Okay.
What is the origin? In Pakistan, we know they expect the British Empire. What about Indonesia? The way it is used and misused with religious minorities, and then what is the dynamics inside the Muslim society concerning the emancipation of women. Because we have groups like Tablighi Jamaat, for example, that practice a total seclusion of women, and lots of restrictions about their freedom of religion. Thank you.
Am I audible? Yeah. Blasphemy laws, they're actually very ill-defined in Indonesia. It's mainly based on these fatwas that people have been on the receiving end of these accusations of blasphemy. There has been an attempt actually of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono when he was president to actually develop an international protocol against blasphemy through the United Nations, but he caught a lot of flack for that internally. So there is no outright blasphemy laws like you have in Pakistan and even in Malaysia, where there is clearly defined now by courts even that Christians in Malaysia cannot use the word Allah, which is ridiculous because the Arabs don't even have an option not to use the word Allah. So if that's a sort of the current term, yoga is un-Islamic, things like that in Malaysia. Not Indonesia hasn't gone that far yet. But these are not based on codified law where it says this and this and this is blasphemous. It's basically that fatwas by quasi-state organizations like MUI are used by vigilante organizations basically to stir up trouble. Like the most recent example is with the candidate governor of Jakarta, Ahok, who said something about a particular surah in the Quran, basically telling Muslims to read their own scripture properly, and then suddenly after he starts mobilizing people, organizing large demonstrations, saying that is blasphemy. Well, it's actually kind of nonsense because Ahmad is not a Muslim, so you cannot accuse him of blasphemy against Islam. He's beyond the pale. It doesn't apply to him. So they're actually very inconsistent. But, they're a political force to be reckoned with, and unfortunately, both politics and also the judiciary are not immune to these kind of pressures. But it is a very grey area, actually. I'm not a scholar of law, but juridically, I think they're not on a very strong path there that is clearly enshrined in law. It's mainly pandering to the political barometer among Muslim reactionaries that these cases are heard. There's actually a failing, especially during the SBA years, of the state failing in law and order, protecting minorities. Ahmadis and Shia were lynched. They were lynch mobs, and the police simply didn't intervene. And you can see the YouTube clips of these atrocities. And then if you're in a village and you're the single policeman on a motorbike, I don't know if I would jump between the mob and the persecuted person. But the government failed these people miserably in terms of, they have signed up to all the human rights conventions. And the Wageningen Institute was exactly set up because the government is actually obliged, I understand, under these conventions to annually report on the state of affairs, which they don't do. So the Wageningen Institute said, we'll do it for you, to the great embarrassment of the government. It's a very precarious situation that treaties have been signed, in many instances even ratified, so they become law, I understand, but that is not enforced either. But there is indeed tendencies to respond to pressures from Muslim populists with the FPI in the foreground, that the government wants to be seen often to be holier than thou. And that's a very worrying situation. In respect to women's rights, I think it's a bit of a rosier picture. I think women are very much engaged in sort of the intellectual debates I've been talking about, but also institutionally. Both the NU, so the traditionalists even, and the Mohammedia have women's wings, but not segregated. They basically have platforms where women can also really work towards gender equality. At state Islamic universities, they're co-educated, sitting in the same classrooms, not a problem. Just walk around in Indonesia. Yes, veils in the public sphere are much more present than 30, 40 years ago, but it has not really undermined the assertiveness of Indonesian Muslimans. Not at all, I would say. And all these organizations have also, aside from their women's wings, also think tanks that deal with women's issues, often on a grassroots level. And who has the Fahmida Institute in Cirebon, which is countries, there's a lot of work actually also for women not living in big cities but in rural areas, because too much attention for gender issues only deals with highly educated urban ladies, while the vast majority of the Indonesian population still lives in rural areas. And who, having their vast constituency in rural Java, is sensitive to that and actually gives women platforms. So probably in comparison with a lot of other Muslim countries, there's quite a lot of space. But again, the whole spectrum is available in Indonesia, from progressive to reactionary. So you also find now in Indonesia women who wear the niqab, which is a very un-Indonesian thing. And most Indonesian women, even the ones who wear hijab, think that that goes much too far. But it does exist. It's a big country, and all styles, flavors, and shapes of Islam are present there. But I would say that the vast majority is much more of a moderate inclination in Indonesia. But it cannot be denied that indeed in the public sphere, manifestations of piety, let's put it that way, are much more visible and salient also in Indonesian society. So the country is not immune to these broader trends that have also affected the wider Muslim world, but on a scale, the positives probably still outweigh in Indonesia, but the polarization we have seen since 2005 actually demonstrates that you have to remain vigilant, and that regime change is just the beginning of a lot of hard work. And people got to brace themselves that we are talking in generation here, not another decade or anything of a shorter timeline.
Another question, comment? Yes?
Thank you. From Central Asia, Muslim world, there were huge participations. But in Indonesia, I think it's not the case. I didn't see.
Say that again. In Central Asia, you have what?
Participation to Syrian war.
Oh, right, yes.
But Indonesia, I think it's not the case, if I'm not wrong.
Well, there have been a few, but if you look at the fact that Indonesia has 250 million people, and when you're talking about Indonesian jihadis joining ISIS or other militias in Syria, you're talking about individuals. Yes, it's almost negligible, but that is not to deny that there is very shady local organizations present in Indonesia, and there has been quite a bit of lip service locally, that people sort of say they sympathize with ISIS or think it's a good thing what is happening there. But yes, you do not have the worrying thing like you have in a country like Tunisia, which also had a sort of a successful regime change, and people left for Syria in droves from a much smaller country. You do not see that in Indonesia, and probably one explanation for that, aside from temperament, is that Indonesia's democratization process is relatively successful, while in Tunisia it suffered maybe a harder setback, and the economic situation is still very dire, which triggered the whole Arab Spring in Tunisia in the first place. And probably it also has something to do with that the whole Syrian and Iraq descent into chaos is very much an Arab thing. I mean, you should not forget about that as well. The Indonesians indeed, by inclination, have a tendency to be much more involved in domestic activism, also, good and bad, including violent ones. Very few Indonesians also joined Al-Qaeda, for example, in Afghanistan, but there was a sort of local spin-offs, like JI, they would not join, say, Al-Qaeda proper during the resistance against the Soviet Union and the whole aftermath with the warlords and the Taliban.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm Clarence from Indonesian Embassy, and yeah, I want to make a short comment on presentation. And I have to say that your presentation is very, it's excellent. I think it's extensive and powerful, and you capture the real picture of Islam in Indonesia. And I would like to add a comment that Islam in Indonesia, if you want to understand, just I can make another. Just you go to the list or Corey or Carrefour here, you can find everything from A to Z back to AA. And as presented by Professor Kersten, you can find the big, the Sunni, the Shia, Ahmadiyya, even Baha'i. There's existence in a small village in Java, and still doing their life, and even sometimes there's a threat or pressure from other Islamic groups. I can say Islamic groups or Mazhab. You can find Hanafi, any kind of Mazhab that you learn from Islam, then you can find in Indonesia. And also, I can say that the democratization can go along with the Islam in Indonesia, and it is a living proof. And I can also extract from the presentation that democratization, and it's I think it's just very good, and it's different from the most media or Western media captured Islam. And I can say also that Islam in Indonesia is not very well captured by the Western media, and that's what we in Indonesia would like to present more. And I think, with this event, I think this is quite useful to promote Islam Nusantara, because it's just very, very, to me, I can really, I live in what Professor Kersten history presentation. I live in every element in the presentation. It's very, as I said, it's excellent because it's captured at least what I learned, and I live in Indonesia. That's the picture of Islam in Indonesia. And one more question about the people, influential people in Indonesia. You always present all the people. I just want to know where did you put the MHA in magic, because it's also one of the.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think, the person who refers to is a famous artist known in Indonesia, who sort of uses music and poetry to promote Islam. I could consider that part of Islam cultural, very much so. But it is a sort of maybe a less intellectualized type of Islam. There is an interesting book where he features very prominently, which is called Islamic Spectrum of Java by Timothy Daniels. People who are interested in more artistic manifestations of Indonesian Islam are sort of refer to that. And there is a film, Islam Nusantara, which you can see on YouTube, where I think he's in it. So that is even more visual than my presentation, and they also interview people on the ground, which is and it has English subtitles. It's called just Islam Nusantara. If you Google it or go on YouTube, you get a very fancy film. It's quite long. I think it's 4 or 5 segments, but it gives you a real good flavor with nice cinematography added to it. Mind-blowing stills.
I also have a question. Okay. Really thank you very much for this wide presentation, because Indonesia is so important and so so not well known in the West. But still, I have a question on the last part of your presentation, because you were saying that Indonesia was becoming greener, although and more conservative in some way, although you presented a complex image with the women being there with many complex dynamics. But then you were kind of saying, I thought it was implicit that maybe it was because of transnational offer, but would you see that there would be some aspiration from the society that would explain in some way this greener tendency? Because it's always what we hear, it's because there is something from abroad.
Yeah.
And to me it's not maybe enough, so I'd like to know what you would think would come really from the society as such that would maybe explain this tendency.
It is exactly a debate among Indonesian Muslims themselves as well. They know fully well they cannot isolate themselves from developments elsewhere, nor do they want to. And as was reiterated also by the representative of the embassy, I like that one, Islam Carrefour, that's a nice one. Supermarket Islam, you can find anything you like in Indonesia, it is present. That means also tendencies to adopt practices that sort of have currency throughout the Muslim world, what they often call then transnational Islam, which in these instances does have a bit of an Arabic flavor to it, in adoption of dress styles. Not everybody is in favor of it, but some people do feel that if they do that, they're part of the larger ummah. It's maybe not the motivations are not entirely negative. I can sort of imagine there is something reassuring also about it, that if you travel through the Muslim world and you see similar hijab styles, that does something. But again, not all Muslims subscribe to it, agree with it. There is, with the growing confidence among Indonesian Muslims, also a tendency to sort of resist. This is what they often call Arabization of Indonesian Islam. And it's often the superficial dimensions of it, say dress styles and using more Arabic words or stuff like that, and doing nasheed and these type of things. They are maybe not that important. It becomes a bit more worrying on the intellectual scene, but they're also, Indonesians are really also Islamic omnivores, also in the intellectual scene. And what I always find interesting, if you walk into the bookstores around these state Islamic universities, you find everything translated. Yes, Said Qutb is there, but next to it is Akul. And Foucault and Derrida and the books from Frans Fanon. You can't make it up, or the Indonesians have translated it. And I find it interesting that even books on post-colonial theory and post-modern philosophy, you find in bookstores that have, at the door, Islamic bookstore. These books are not Islamic, but Muslims apparently want to read them. And Indonesians have taken the trouble of translating them. Translating Arkoun and Derrida into Indonesian. What a nightmare. I barely understand it in French.
Thank you so much. It's getting late. Reduce my question to simply yes or no.
I'll ask that from an academic.
Well, you mentioned secularism or secularization without entering into details of the difference between
Okay.
But my question is really in this whole discourse on secularization. Is there a current, or is there the idea of exporting this not only within, or any other idea, within the Islam world, but also worldwide? I'm asking this because in South Asia, compared with, there is definitely a feeling that, hey, this idea of secularism, which is being promoted to, well, a European value or Western value, we have something to add as well. It's not a monopoly of the West, whatever that is. There is definitely a different concept of secularism.
Yes.
For instance, in India, surrounding countries. Do you have this? Have you noticed this in Indonesia? That this is a message to
ambitious. I think it was mainly for home consumption, but when Hugolis Majid launched into this debate, and it became polemical, and he wrote a text where he explained what he meant with secularization and secularism, where he accepted the former and sort of rejected the latter. He got a lot of flack, and a lot of people had that distinction that is just sophistry, it's basically the same. But he really, he got the idea in the 60s when he had traveled to America and had read the books by Harvey Cox and Peter Berger and later Robert Bella. But he translated it very much also into Indonesian Islamic terms. He said what we're basically dealing with is that, human life has two dimensions, and he used a sort of Indonesianized Arabic. He said you have the ukhrawi dimension, you the hereafter, and your relation with God. He said that is not even accessible to, because he ties it up very much with the use of reason, also within the Muslim world. The iman, it's not even accessible to reason. That's why it's called faith. But he say that is between you as an individual believer, and even as the ummah as a whole, with the transcendent. But then you have the other dimension of human life, dunyawi. He said that is interhuman contact, and those relations we have to organize based on that other faculty we have as humans, which is aql, reason. So he said he calls one the horizontal dimension, that is interhuman activity, and the other one is the vertical dimension with the divine. And he said that is shaped by iman, and it has to do with this innate ability we have as humans, fitra, the ability to be religious, and manifestation of that, he says, he calls it taqwa. So he uses the vocabulary even of Islam to demonstrate that it is not an alien import. Secularization, yes, that word comes from Latin, so be it, but the process affects each and every society, even when there was no word for it. That is basically its message. But don't turn it into secularism. Don't declare it into an ideology of an inescapable trajectory, predefined, exactly the same as what the West has done then from Renaissance through Reformation and Enlightenment, because that's European intellectual history. We have our own. But the process is happening. That is basically how he explained it. Not everybody was sensitive to his explanation. He had to write reposts, and he was ostracized by some blogs. But he really thought that you can jump up and down. It is happening to our societies, and there is nothing un-Islamic about it. That was his point. But we have to use words to communicate, and a certain term catches on, and you can say, well, you have to be purists and use something else. Like that thing here is called an ordinateur, but in Holland we do call it a computer.
The time is running out, but okay, maybe one last question or comment. Can you keep it short, please?
Hi. Which influence does the current Indonesian President Jokowi have on the Islam in Indonesia?
What influences?
Yeah, if he has one.
He is clearly, I think, much more uncomfortable with it than Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono was, his predecessor. And I think SBA saw it as a tool to put Indonesia on the map. And I think Jokowi is much more a down-to-earth figure. And that may have something to do with his personality and his lack of experience of dealing with the wider world, which, SBA was very ambitious. I remember he was in London 2009, I think, at the G20, and he came to give a talk at the university next door from where I work. I'm at King's, and he came to speak at LSE, the Libyan School of Economics, as we call it now. After they took that Gaddafi money. And he gave a speech there where he presented Indonesia as what he called a bridge country. He clearly had an ambition for Indonesia to become an international player. You know, make it what they call the second eye in the BRIC. Brazil, Russia, India, China. He thinks Indonesia has the potential of at least being on par with Brazil. And he also said, and we are well positioned for it, geographically, culturally, and politically. And Indonesia can be a rich country between the Muslim world, the rest of Asia, and the West, because we're friends with everybody. Yeah? And then he does funny things like ask for a blasphemy protocol. So Suharto was not the last president to give mixed signals in that respect. Jokowi is much more focused domestically, but he's a crafty politician. And an example of that was when he felt obliged to go to one of these mass rallies that had been convened by FPI against Ahok, and insisted that he was going to, be charged with blasphemy and that a Christian Chinese could not become government of Pakistan, for a Muslim country that was just not acceptable. So he showed up at that rally, and everybody got very tense because, what was this, an endorsement of the rally? And then he said, people, it's Friday, let's pray. And he sort of diffused the whole thing. Because FPI, these were all good Muslims. How could you refuse to make salah with the president? And that was a smart move. So I think he's very crafty, but I get the impression he would rather have these things go away than turning it into a political tool. Because Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's Democrat Party also ran on a ticket what he called nationalisme religieuse. Yeah, so he really made religion part of his political message, but in many instances, it only creates political blowbacks. It's very risky. And I think Jokowi is in that sense probably more discerning, and he tries to stay away from it.
Well, I'm afraid we have to stop, in spite of this very, very, very interesting conference by Professor Carool Kersten. The last word goes to Professor Michel.
Thank you. Well, just to thank you all for coming for this inaugural conference. I would like to thank really Professor Kersten for the great day we spent today with him. Also, just to make you a lot of advertising, as we will have, so we just started this conferences, and we will have another conference in about a month. That will be Thursday, the 16th of March, and it will be with Professor Eberger, and we will have news about that on the. Maybe you want to say something?
The title is it will be in French this time. Les chrétiens en islam, c'est le main title. Les chrétiens en islam. Donc le professeur Bernard Berger de l'école des hautes études en sciences sociales. Donc le 16 mars en soirée à Bruxelles, mais on ne connaît pas encore l'endroit. Pas ici en tout cas, puisque la salle n'est pas libre ce soir. Sinon, voilà. Voilà, encore. Thank you.